A police officer abuses his power, kicking a pregnant black woman during a routine traffic stop. But when he learns who her husband is, everything changes. What could lead someone in authority to such an unthinkable act, and what happens when their unchecked actions finally catch up to them? Have you ever faced a moment where injustice left you stunned and helpless? Or have you witnessed someone endure unfair treatment, powerless to stop it? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Emma Johnson's hands gripped the steering wheel as she eased her car down the quiet suburban road. The day had been uneventful, a routine prenatal checkup, a few polite exchanges with the doctor, and now the drive home. At 7 months pregnant, she moved with the weariness of someone carrying more than just the weight of her unborn child. But Emma was used to balancing burdens, and today felt no different. Suddenly, red and blue lights flared in her rearview mirror, accompanied by the sharp wail of a siren. Her chest tightened as her first thought darted to her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. Everything about her car was in order. So why was she being stopped? She pulled over to the side of the road, her heartbeat quickening. Emma had heard enough stories to know that a routine traffic stop didn't always end the way it should. Her husband, Ethan Walker, a prominent attorney who specialized in exposing police misconduct, often spoke of such cases over dinner. It's not about guilt or innocence, he'd say. It's about power dynamics, and those dynamics aren't in our favor. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. Her fingers moved quickly to retrieve her license and registration as the officer approached her vehicle. His reflection in the side mirror struck her first. A tall, broad-shouldered man, white, with a steely gaze that held no warmth. His hand rested casually on the grip of his holstered gun, the gesture subtle but deliberate. When Officer David Carter stopped by her window, he didn't bother with pleasantries. "License and registration," he barked, his tone clipped and impatient. Emma handed over the documents without a word, her hands steady despite the apprehension rising in her chest. "Where are you headed?" he asked, scanning her license but not bothering to meet her eyes. "Home," Emma replied evenly. "I've just come from my doctor's office." David's eyes flicked to her stomach, then back to her face, his expression unreadable. "Is there anything in the vehicle I should know about?" "No," she said, her voice firmer now. He leaned slightly closer, his presence filling the space between them. "Mind if I take a look inside?" Emma hesitated, a flicker of anger creeping into her voice. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. Is there a reason for this stop?" David straightened, his demeanor growing colder. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, ignoring her question entirely. Emma froze. The directive was sudden, unnecessary, and clearly meant to intimidate. She glanced at her hands, resting protectively on her stomach. "Sir, I don't understand why." "Step out now," David interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through her protest. Emma's heart pounded. She could feel the weight of the situation shifting, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. Slowly, she opened her door, stepping out into the late afternoon light. As soon as her feet touched the pavement, David circled her like a predator, sizing up its prey. "Turn around," he snapped. She complied, though every instinct screamed at her to protect herself. Her thoughts raced. What had she done to provoke this? Why was he escalating the situation? David's scrutiny was relentless. "Spread your arms," he commanded. Her voice quivered, though she tried to keep it steady. "Officer, I don't understand. Are you going to comply, or do I need to take action?" His hand hovered near his belt, where the grip of his taser was visible. Emma swallowed hard, raising her arms reluctantly. Her breathing was shallow now, panic threatening to take hold. "What's in the bag on the passenger seat?" he demanded, his tone accusatory. "My hospital paperwork," she said. "You're welcome to check it." But David wasn't looking for answers. His tone carried no curiosity, only disdain. "Hospital paperwork, huh? Convenient." Emma turned to face him, her frustration finally bubbling over. "I don't know what you think I've done, but this is harassment. I've complied with every." David cut her off, stepping closer than necessary, his posture looming. "Let me tell you something," he sneered. "You don't dictate how this goes. I do. You think you can talk your way out of this?" The tension reached a boiling point. Emma's body tensed, every nerve screaming at her to stand her ground. But she knew better than to provoke him further. "I'm 7 months pregnant," she said, her voice low but steady. "I've done nothing to deserve this treatment." David smirked, a cruel edge in his expression. "You people always think you're above the law." Those words hit Emma like a blow. She had heard them before, coded language for prejudice, a justification for dehumanization. But before she could respond, David's radio crackled, breaking the momentary silence. "Carter, what's your status?" the voice on the other end inquired. "Busy," David replied tersely, his eyes never leaving Emma. The exchange left her feeling exposed, as though she were being toyed with. She knew, deep down, that this was not about enforcing the law. It was about exerting control, about sending a message. When David finally stepped back, it wasn't out of decency but calculation. He handed her documents back without a word, his expression unrepentant. "You can go," he said flatly, as if granting her permission to exist. Emma stood frozen for a moment, her body trembling with anger and fear. She climbed back into her car, shutting the door with deliberate care. As she pulled back onto the road, her hands gripping the wheel tighter than before, she glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. David was still standing there, watching her go, his expression as cold and unreadable as ever. Emma knew this wasn't over. David's actions weren't an isolated incident. They were part of a larger system that Ethan had warned her about time and again. But this time, it was personal. David Carter's eyes narrowed as he handed Emma back her license, his grip firm and deliberate. The pause that followed felt charged, as though he was waiting for her to say or do something incriminating. Emma noticed the way he scrutinized her, not just as a driver, but as a black woman. "Is this your car?" he asked abruptly, his tone sharp and edged with suspicion. Emma blinked, confused by the question. "Yes, it's my car," she replied firmly, though her voice carried the tremor of restrained frustration. David tilted his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Nice ride," he said, his tone dripping with insinuation. "How'd you afford it?" Emma's jaw tightened. "I'm not sure why that matters, officer," she said, keeping her tone measured, despite the insult. David ignored her response and took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel beside her car. "Your registration says you live in this neighborhood. That true?" "Yes," she replied curtly. "Funny," he muttered, more to himself than her. "Doesn't seem like you'd belong around here." Emma's grip on the steering wheel tightened as her frustration turned to indignation. "Officer, is there a specific reason I was pulled over?" David's demeanor shifted, his smirk fading into a hard scowl. "Let me ask the questions," he snapped, "and don't play coy with me. You looked nervous back there. Got something to hide?" Emma exhaled sharply, doing her best to keep calm. "Nervous? I'm 7 months pregnant, officer. I was on my way home from the hospital. That's all." David didn't seem to hear her explanation. He leaned in closer, his hand once again resting on his holstered weapon. "Hospital, huh? What for? Picking up pills." Emma froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Excuse me? You heard me?" David said, his tone icy. "There's a lot of that going around these days. Pregnant women dealing, hiding stuff in the car." "That's absurd," Emma retorted, her voice rising slightly. "I told you I was coming from a doctor's appointment. You can see the paperwork right there on the seat." David straightened, his eyes darting briefly to the bag on her passenger seat. "Maybe I should take a look, just to be sure." Emma's pulse quickened. "There's no reason for you to search my car," she said firmly. David's expression darkened. "Are you refusing to comply?" "I'm saying you don't have probable cause," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the fear creeping in. David chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Probable cause? Let me tell you something. Out here, I decide what's probable cause. You don't get to tell me how to do my job." Emma could feel her resolve faltering, but she refused to let him see it. "I know my rights, officer, and I've done nothing wrong." David took another step closer, now towering over her. "You're awfully mouthy for someone who doesn't want trouble." Emma met his gaze, her fear now mingled with defiance. "I'm not looking for trouble, but I'm not going to let you treat me like a criminal for no reason." David's lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced back at the bag on her seat, then back to her face. "What's in the bag, ma'am?" "Hospital paperwork," she repeated, her voice clipped. "And I'm just supposed to take your word for it?" David sneered. Emma's patience finally snapped. "Yes, because that's the truth. If you really think I've done something wrong, tell me. Otherwise, let me go." David's hand moved to his belt, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. "I don't think you understand how this works," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You don't call the shots. I do. And when I say step out of the car, you step out of the car." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about? I've done nothing to justify this step." "Out," David interrupted, his voice cutting through her protest like a knife. Emma hesitated, her mind racing. She thought of Ethan, of all the stories he'd told her about cases just like this one, situations that spiraled out of control because someone dared to stand their ground. She didn't want to be another statistic, but she also couldn't let him walk all over her. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling but resolute. "Why are you asking me to step out of the car?" David slammed his hand down on the roof of her car, the sound reverberating through the tense air. "Because I said so. Now move." The sudden noise made Emma jump, her hands instinctively moving to her stomach. "You're scaring me," she said quietly. David didn't flinch. "Then do as you're told, and this will go a lot easier for you." Emma clenched her teeth, her anger bubbling beneath the surface. She slowly reached for the door handle, her every movement deliberate. As she stepped out of the car, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. David gestured for her to turn around. "Face the car, hands on the hood." Emma hesitated. "What for? What are you looking for?" David smirked. "Whatever you don't want me to find." Her blood boiled, but she complied, placing her hands on the hood of her car. "This is wrong," she said through gritted teeth. David leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wrong is running your mouth when you should be cooperating." Emma turned her head slightly, meeting his cold gaze. "I'm cooperating, but you're still treating me like a criminal." David stepped back, his eyes scanning her car. "Let's see what else you've got hiding in there." As David began his search, Emma's hands curled into fists against the hood of her car. Every fiber of her being told her this was about more than her car or her actions. It was about her identity. She thought of Ethan again, knowing he would be furious when he heard what was happening. But right now, all she could do was endure. Emma stood with her hands on the hood of the car, every muscle in her body tense as Officer David Carter loomed behind her. His presence felt oppressive, his tone sharp and biting as he barked instructions. She knew his escalating hostility wasn't about enforcing the law, it was about control. "I don't consent to this search," Emma said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her. David scoffed. "You think you're in a position to make demands? I told you to cooperate." Emma turned her head slightly, her tone steady but defiant. "I've done nothing wrong. You're treating me like a criminal without cause. I have rights." Her words struck a nerve. David's face twisted with frustration. "Rights?" he snapped, stepping closer. "You've got a big mouth for someone in your situation." "I'm not resisting," Emma replied calmly, though her hands shook against the cool metal of the car. "I'm just asking you to respect my enough." David's voice boomed, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Turn around and face me!" Emma hesitated, her instincts screaming that this man was a threat. "Officer, I'm pregnant." "Please turn around," he barked, his patience visibly wearing thin. When she didn't move fast enough for his liking, David reached out and grabbed her arm, yanking her away from the car. Emma gasped, her balance faltering as he forced her to face him. "You think you're above the law?" he hissed, his grip tightening. Emma pulled back slightly, her voice rising in desperation. "Let go of me. I haven't done anything to deserve this." The sharpness of her words seemed to snap something in him. Without warning, David lashed out, his boot connecting with Emma's side in a brutal kick. The force of the blow sent her sprawling onto the pavement, a cry of pain escaping her lips as she crumpled to the ground. "Stop!" Emma shouted, clutching her stomach instinctively. Her voice broke, the fear and anguish overwhelming her. "I'm pregnant, please!" But David didn't stop. He took another step toward her, his shadow falling over her as she lay helpless on the asphalt. "You want to keep running your mouth?" he snarled, his foot poised to strike again. Emma's vision blurred with tears as she tried to shield her stomach. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nearby, a small crowd had begun to gather passers-by drawn by the commotion. They watched from a distance, their faces a mixture of shock and hesitation. A man in a hoodie pulled out his phone, discreetly recording the scene from across the street. "Hey, what's going on over there?" someone murmured, but no one moved to intervene. The tension in the air was palpable, fear rooting the onlookers in place. David turned briefly, noticing the growing attention. His eyes landed on the man with the phone, and his expression darkened. "Get out of here," he barked. The man didn't respond, his phone held steady as he continued to record. David turned back to Emma, his jaw clenched. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as though weighing his next move. Then, with a low growl of frustration, he stepped back. "Stay down," he spat, his voice cold and venomous. "You brought this on yourself." Emma didn't respond. She lay curled on the ground, her arms wrapped protectively around her belly. The pain in her side was sharp and relentless, but it was nothing compared to the fear gripping her heart. She couldn't stop thinking about her baby. David adjusted his belt, his movements stiff as he glanced around once more. The onlookers hadn't dispersed. If anything, the crowd had grown. Whispers rippled through the group, the tension thick enough to cut. Realizing the situation was spiraling out of his control, David took a step back, then another. Without another word, he turned and strode quickly to his patrol car. The sound of his engine roared to life, and within moments, he was gone, leaving Emma behind on the pavement. The silence that followed was deafening. Slowly, one of the bystanders, a middle-aged woman clutching a grocery bag, stepped forward. "Are you okay?" she asked, hesitantly, her voice shaking. Emma didn't answer immediately. Her breaths were shallow, her body trembling as she struggled to sit up. "We need to call an ambulance," the man with the phone said, lowering his camera. He moved closer, his expression a mixture of concern and guilt. "Are you hurt?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "My baby." The man's eyes widened, and he quickly pulled out his phone to dial 911. "We've got to get help. Stay still, okay? Don't try to move." Emma nodded weakly, her hand still pressed to her stomach. She could feel the baby's faint movements, a small reassurance amidst the chaos. As the sound of sirens approached in the distance, Emma's mind raced. She had done nothing to deserve this. She had followed the rules, complied with his commands, and yet she had been treated like she was less than human. The ambulance arrived moments later, the paramedics rushing to her side. As they lifted her onto a stretcher, Emma's eyes flicked to the man who had recorded the incident. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice strained, but sincere. He nodded, his face grim. "This isn't right. Someone needs to see what happened to you." As the ambulance doors closed, Emma's thoughts turned to Ethan. He needed to know what had happened. The sound of sirens faded as the ambulance carried Emma home from the hospital, where she had been treated and discharged with instructions to rest. She sat quietly in the passenger seat of a neighbor's car, her arms wrapped protectively around her belly. Every jolt of the vehicle reminded her of the kick she had endured, the pain still sharp in her side. Her neighbor, Clara, glanced at her with concern. "Are you sure you're okay?" "You don't look—" "I'll be fine," Emma cut in softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for helping me." Clara didn't push further. As they pulled into the driveway, another neighbor, Mr. Hawkins, approached from his porch. "I saw the ambulance," he said quickly. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Emma opened her mouth but hesitated. How could she explain what had happened without her voice cracking? She simply nodded and allowed Clara to explain the basics, while Mr. Hawkins helped her to the door. Inside, the living room was dim, the curtains drawn against the setting sun. Emma sank onto the couch, her body heavy with exhaustion. Clara lingered near the doorway. "Do you want me to stay until Ethan gets home?" Emma shook her head. "No, thank you. You've already done more than enough." Clara hesitated, but eventually left, promising to check in tomorrow. Alone, Emma leaned back, her mind replaying the events of the day in relentless loops. The sound of the front door opening startled her, and she looked up to see Ethan stepping inside, his briefcase in one hand and a file folder in the other. He froze the moment his eyes landed on her. "Emma," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What happened?" Her swollen eyes, the way she clutched her stomach, everything about her appearance screamed pain and fear. Ethan dropped his belongings onto the floor and crossed the room in seconds, kneeling in front of her. "Tell me," he urged, his hands gently cupping her face. "What's wrong? Is the baby okay?" Emma swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she began to recount the traffic stop. Every detail spilled out David Carter's accusations, his escalating hostility, and finally, the violent kick that sent her to the ground. Ethan's face darkened with every word. By the time she finished, his jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like he might shatter his teeth. "He kicked you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Emma nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "He didn't care that I was pregnant, Ethan. He didn't care about anything. He just wanted to hurt me." Ethan's hands trembled as he took hers in his. "I can't believe this," he muttered, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "That bastard." Emma's tears spilled over as she clung to him. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I thought I might lose the baby." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "You won't have to go through this alone," he said firmly. "I swear to you, Emma, I'll make him pay for what he did. This isn't going to be another story that gets swept under the rug." Emma pulled back slightly, her tear-streaked face filled with both fear and gratitude. "How?" "He's a cop, Ethan. They'll cover for him." Ethan's eyes burned with determination. "Then I'll tear their cover apart piece by piece. He's not above the law, no matter how untouchable he thinks he is." As he spoke, Emma's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She reached for it hesitantly, her fingers still unsteady. The notification was from a number she didn't recognize. "It's a message," she said, her voice quiet. Ethan leaned closer as she opened it. Attached to the text was a video. As it began to play, both of them watched in stunned silence. The grainy footage clearly showed David Carter kicking Emma, her body crumpling to the ground. His voice was faint but unmistakable as he spat threats at her before storming back to his patrol car. Emma's hand flew to her mouth. "Someone recorded it," she whispered. Ethan's eyes remained locked on the screen, his expression growing darker with each passing second. "This," he said slowly, "is what we need." Emma glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "This video is proof," Ethan said, his voice rising with resolve. "It's not just your word against his anymore. We can use this to hold him accountable." Emma's doubts lingered. "But will it be enough?" "You know how these cases go. They'll try to spin it, make it look like I did something to provoke him." Ethan shook his head. "Not this time. This is too clear to ignore. And I'm not just going after him. I'm going after the entire system that protects people like him." Emma searched his face, seeing the fire in his eyes. For the first time since the incident, a sliver of hope crept into her heart. "What do we do now?" she asked. Ethan rose to his feet, his mind already racing with plans. "We start by making sure this video gets into the right hands. Then we gather more evidence. Witnesses, reports, anything we can use to build a case. This isn't just about one bad cop, Emma. This is about making sure they can't get away with this again." Emma watched him pace the room, his energy unshakable. "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" Ethan stopped and looked at her, his expression softening. "For you? For our baby? Absolutely. They messed with the wrong family." That night, as Ethan sat at his desk poring over the video and making a list of potential witnesses to contact, Emma felt a flicker of hope. They weren't powerless. With Ethan's resolve and the video evidence in hand, they had the first building block in their fight for justice. The next morning, Emma's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications poured in, lighting up the screen with messages, tags, and alerts. Ethan glanced over from his laptop, his face tightening as he watched her scroll through the chaos. "It's everywhere," Emma said, her voice a mix of disbelief and unease. The video of her encounter with Officer David Carter had exploded across social media. What started as a single post from an anonymous witness had turned into a viral storm. The hashtags "Justice for Emma" and "Accountability Now" trended nationwide within hours. The video, raw and unfiltered, left little room for doubt. Viewers watched in outrage as David's boot connected with Emma's side, sending her to the ground. His voice, cold and authoritative, played over the haunting footage. Ethan leaned closer, his focus sharpening as he read the comments flooding the posts. "This is sickening. That cop needs to be fired immediately. How many more times do we have to see this happen before something changes? Stop blaming the system. She was probably resisting arrest. He was just doing his job. You don't know what led up to this." Ethan's fist clenched at the range of responses. For every comment condemning David's actions, there was another defending him, twisting the narrative. "Doing his job," Ethan repeated bitterly, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Since when does doing your job include assaulting a pregnant woman?" Emma put the phone down, her hands trembling. "It's not just the comments, Ethan. People are sharing my name, my photo. I didn't ask for this." Ethan reached for her hand, his voice steady. "You didn't ask for it, but it's out there now. And it's a weapon we can use. People are paying attention, but not all of them care about the truth," Emma replied. "Some of them think I deserved it, that I must have done something wrong." Ethan nodded, his expression hardening. "That's why we can't just rely on public outrage. We need more than this video. We need a case so airtight they can't ignore it." At that moment, Ethan's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a direct message from a stranger. He opened it and found another video attached, this one from a different angle. The person had recorded the entire incident from a parked car nearby, capturing David's face clearly as he yelled at Emma. "Look at this," Ethan said, showing Emma the screen. Her eyes widened. "Another video." "It's even clearer," Ethan said, his voice rising with hope. This shows everything: his face, his aggression, the kick. It's exactly what we need. Emma exhaled, her relief tinged with apprehension. But what happens next? People are angry now. But will it matter when it comes to court? Ethan stood, the resolve in his posture unmistakable. It will matter if we build the right case. I'm not letting this die down. As the day went on, the video continued to spread. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying the reach. Cable networks ran headlines like "Officer Under Fire After Assaulting Pregnant Woman," and viral video sparks calls for justice against police misconduct. David Carter's name became synonymous with the growing outcry. Social media users dug into his past, uncovering other complaints of excessive force and racial bias that had been quietly dismissed. The revelations poured fuel onto the fire. By mid-afternoon, Ethan received a call from a local civil rights organization offering support. "We saw the video," the caller said. "If there's anything we can do to help you pursue this, let us know." "This can't go unanswered." "Thank you," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "I'll be in touch." As public pressure mounted, the debate online grew more polarized. On one side, activists and citizens demanded accountability, calling for David's immediate suspension and a full investigation into his actions. On the other, defenders of law enforcement rallied behind him, insisting he had been unfairly vilified. "He's a decorated officer," one comment read. "People love to jump to conclusions without knowing the full story." Another countered, "The story is in the video. You can't justify what he did." Ethan spent hours sifting through the flood of reactions, mentally categorizing the voices of support and dissent. By evening, he had compiled a list of individuals who had reached out with potential evidence or offers to testify. "Emma," he said, turning to her as she rested on the couch, "I've got names, witnesses, people who were there and want to speak up. And those videos, every angle helps strengthen the case." Emma looked at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "You really think we can win this?" "We don't have a choice," Ethan said simply. "If we don't fight, they'll sweep this under the rug, just like they've done before. But if we act now, while the public is watching, we can hold them accountable." Emma nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, her voice firm despite the weariness in her eyes. "Let's do it." Ethan wasted no time. That night, he drafted a formal request for records on David Carter's disciplinary history, knowing the process would likely be met with resistance. He also began reaching out to legal colleagues, rallying a network of attorneys who specialized in civil rights cases. The community's outrage was a double-edged sword. While it kept the pressure on, Ethan knew it could also give David's defenders ammunition to claim bias or mob justice. He needed to stay ahead, to build a case so solid that no one could dismiss it as hysteria. Ethan sat across from Mark Peterson in the corner booth of a dimly lit cafe. Mark, a fellow attorney and trusted confidant, sifted through the stack of documents Ethan had laid out between them. The tension in the air was palpable as they spoke in hushed tones, ensuring no one overheard. "This guy's a time bomb," Mark muttered, flipping through pages of notes and printouts. "David Carter's disciplinary record is squeaky clean, but I don't buy it. Not with what we've seen." "Exactly," Ethan replied, his voice low but firm. "No one escalates like that during a traffic stop unless they've been doing it for years and getting away with it." Mark nodded. "If his record's spotless, it's because someone's been covering for him." "That's what I need to prove," Ethan said, leaning forward. "The question is how." Mark's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. "Give me a second," he said, stepping away from the table to take the call. Ethan tapped his fingers against the table, his mind racing. He thought about the videos, the witnesses, and the mounting public pressure. They had enough to prove David's misconduct during Emma's stop, but that wouldn't be enough to dismantle the larger system protecting him. He needed more patterns, a trail of negligence or corruption that went beyond this single incident. Mark returned moments later, his face unreadable. "That was one of my contacts in the department," he said as he slid back into the booth. "She's young, new to the job, and she hates the culture there. Says it's toxic, full of guys like Carter who think they're untouchable." Ethan's eyes lit up. "Will she talk?" Mark hesitated. "She's scared, but she's willing to share some documents anonymously. Internal memos, complaints that never saw the light of day. She says there's a lot of dirt." Ethan exhaled sharply. "That's the break we need." If we can show that the department knew what Carter was doing and let it slide, it's not just about him anymore. It's about the whole system. 2 days later, Ethan received a manila envelope in the mail, the contents smuggled out of the precinct by Mark's contact. Inside were internal reports that painted a damning picture. Formal complaints from civilians alleging excessive force, use of force reviews marked inconclusive, and emails between senior officers that suggested efforts to bury investigations. Ethan spread the documents across his desk, his pulse quickening as he read through them. One case caught his attention, a man who had filed a complaint against Carter for assault during a routine stop. The case had been quietly closed, citing insufficient evidence, even though the man had presented photos of his injuries. "This is it," Ethan said aloud, calling Mark. "Carter has a pattern, and the department has been shielding him." Mark's voice was cautious. "This is good, but it's risky. If we're going after the department, they're going to fight back hard. They'll come after you too." "I'm ready for that," Ethan replied without hesitation. "They've gotten away with this for too long. It's time someone held them accountable." The deeper Ethan dug, the clearer the pattern became. David Carter wasn't just a rogue officer. He was a symptom of a larger problem. Internal emails revealed how complaints against him were routinely downplayed or dismissed. Some officers had even raised concerns about his behavior during internal meetings, only to be silenced by higher-ups. Ethan and Mark sat in Ethan's office late into the night, piecing together the timeline of David's unchecked misconduct. "This one's brutal," Mark said, pointing to a file. "He broke a guy's wrist during a traffic stop and claimed the man resisted arrest. No charges were filed, and the department cleared him of wrongdoing." "Typical," Ethan muttered, his frustration mounting. "It's not just about Carter. It's about the system that lets people like him thrive." Mark nodded. "We've got enough here to show a pattern. This isn't just one bad cop. It's a department-wide failure." The next day, Ethan reached out to several witnesses from Emma's case. Most were hesitant, afraid of retaliation or the potential backlash of getting involved. But one man, the same individual who had filmed the initial video, agreed to testify anonymously. "I saw the whole thing," the man told Ethan during a phone call. "He didn't care that she was pregnant. He just wanted to intimidate her." "That testimony could be critical," Ethan said. "Thank you for coming forward." Meanwhile, news of Ethan's investigation began to circulate within the precinct. The pressure created a rift among the officers. Younger recruits, disillusioned by the department's culture, quietly expressed support for reform. Others, loyal to their colleagues and the status quo, closed ranks around Carter. One officer, a veteran nearing retirement, confronted the whistleblower who had shared the internal documents. "You don't belong here if you can't handle how we do things," he sneered. "You mean covering for each other?" she shot back, her voice steady. "That's not what I signed up for." The division within the precinct only added fuel to Ethan's case. The department's internal strife leaked into the media, with anonymous sources revealing stories of officers pressured to stay silent about misconduct. Ethan wasted no time. He filed a formal lawsuit against David Carter and the police department, alleging not just excessive force, but systemic negligence and corruption. The filing immediately drew attention, both from the media and from the department itself. That evening, as Ethan and Mark reviewed the final version of their complaint, Ethan's phone rang. It was a reporter from a prominent news outlet. "We're running a story on your case," the reporter said. "Sources say the department's trying to discredit you and your wife. Do you have a response?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Let them try," he said, his voice calm but resolute. We have the truth on our side, and I'm not backing down." As the lawsuit made headlines, the stakes grew higher. The department began its counteroffensive, determined to protect its reputation. But Ethan was prepared for the fight, knowing that exposing the truth was the only way to ensure justice for Emma and for everyone who had been silenced before her. The weeks leading up to the trial were a whirlwind of pressure, threats, and relentless preparation. Ethan Walker sat in his office reviewing deposition statements. When his phone buzzed on the desk, a text message popped up from an unknown number. "Drop the case or you'll regret it." Ethan stared at the message for a moment, his jaw tightening. It wasn't the first threat he had received since filing the lawsuit against Officer David Carter and the police department. Calls, emails, Even handwritten notes left at his office, all anonymous, all aimed at intimidating him into backing down. He deleted the message and went back to work. Ethan had long anticipated this kind of pushback, and he wasn't going to let fear derail his fight for justice. Meanwhile, Emma sat at home, her nerves frayed. The media had latched onto her story with a ferocity she hadn't expected. News vans parked outside their neighborhood, reporters eager to get a soundbite or a glimpse of the woman at the center of the controversy. Every time she stepped outside, someone called out questions. Emma, do you think you're being used to push an anti-police agenda? Do you regret filing the lawsuit? Do you think Officer Carter was just doing his job? Emma did her best to ignore them, but their words gnawed at her. She felt like her life was being dissected and debated by strangers who didn't know her or what she had endured. Ethan came home one evening to find her sitting on the couch, the television off but her expression distant. "They won't stop," she said quietly, looking up at him. "Everywhere I go, it's like I'm under a microscope. They want me to doubt myself, Ethan." Ethan sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "That's exactly what they want," he said firmly. "But you can't let them win. You didn't ask for any of this, but you have the strength to see it through. We both do." Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. "I just hate that they're trying to twist the truth. Like that lawyer of his." She was referring to the recent press conference held by Carter's defense attorney, Michael Harper, a seasoned litigator known for his aggressive tactics. Harper had wasted no time attacking the credibility of the video evidence. "The footage is heavily edited," Harper claimed to reporters. "It doesn't show the full context of the interaction. My client was simply following protocol, and we believe the truth will vindicate him in court." Ethan had watched the conference live, his anger simmering as Harper skillfully planted seeds of doubt. Harper implied that Emma's behavior during the stop was confrontational, and that Carter had acted within his authority. "They're trying to make you the villain," Ethan told Emma. "But they can't erase what really happened. The videos, the witnesses, it's all too strong." Still, Harper's tactics had forced Ethan to pivot. He spent the next several days reaching out to additional witnesses, piecing together a more comprehensive narrative. One afternoon, Ethan received a call from a young woman named Tara, a former intern at the precinct who had seen Carter's behavior firsthand. "I wasn't there that day," Tara admitted, "but I saw him act like that before. He'd escalate situations on purpose, especially with people of color. Everyone knew it, but no one spoke up. They were too scared of retaliation." Ethan's pen scratched across his notepad as she spoke. "Would you be willing to testify?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I don't know. If they find out it was me, I'll lose any chance of working in law enforcement again." "I understand," Ethan said gently. "But think about the difference your testimony could make. You have the power to help stop this from happening to anyone else." Tara sighed. "Let me think about it. I'll call you back." As the trial date approached, the tension between Ethan and Carter grew palpable. The two finally came face to face during a preliminary hearing. Carter sat at the defense table, his eyes locked on Ethan with a mixture of disdain and defiance. Ethan refused to be intimidated. As the hearing progressed, Harper once again attacked the credibility of the video evidence, arguing that its viral nature had tainted public opinion and made a fair trial impossible. "The court needs to consider whether this media circus has already decided the outcome," Harper said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "My client deserves due process, not trial by internet." Ethan stood to respond, his tone calm but unwavering. "What my client deserves is accountability," he said, gesturing toward Emma, who sat quietly in the gallery. "The video shows exactly what happened. Officer Carter didn't act in self-defense, and he didn't follow protocol. He used violence against a pregnant woman without cause. And the evidence speaks for itself." The judge listened intently, but Ethan could see Harper's strategy at work. By framing the case as a rush to judgment, he was trying to shift attention away from Carter's actions and toward the public backlash. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust forward as questions flew. Harper used the opportunity to paint Carter as a victim of an overzealous media. Ethan, however, stayed focused on the facts. When asked for comment, he kept his response brief but powerful. "This isn't about public opinion," he said. It's about justice for Emma and ensuring that no one else suffers the way she did. The evidence is clear, and we're ready to prove it in court. That evening, Ethan and Emma sat together at the kitchen table, their exhaustion evident, but their determination unshaken. "They're trying to make this as hard as possible," Emma said, her voice tinged with frustration. "But we can't let them win." "We won't," Ethan assured her. "Harper can spin all he wants, but the truth will come out in court. They can't hide behind excuses forever." The courtroom was silent as Ethan Walker rose from his seat, every eye fixed on him. He adjusted his tie and approached the jury with measured steps, his face a mask of focus and determination. On the other side of the room, Officer David Carter sat rigidly, his lawyer Michael Harper whispering something into his ear. Ethan began without hesitation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about protocol. It's not about procedure. It's about abuse of power. What happened to my client, Emma Walker, was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was an intentional act of violence fueled by prejudice and a system that protects those who abuse their authority." He paced in front of the jury box, his voice steady but firm. "You've seen the video. You've heard the accounts. Officer Carter kicked a pregnant woman to the ground during a routine traffic stop. Not because she posed a threat, but because he thought he could. This isn't just about Emma, it's about a pattern of unchecked aggression that's been allowed to fester." Michael Harper stood as soon as Ethan paused. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making inflammatory statements." The judge, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, raised her hand. "Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Walker." Ethan nodded, then turned back to the jury. "We'll show you evidence that this wasn't the first time Officer Carter abused his position. Complaints were filed against him, complaints that were ignored or buried by his department. This isn't just one bad day. It's a history of misconduct." Harper's turn came next. He adjusted his jacket as he addressed the jury, his tone polished and confident. "What my esteemed colleague failed to mention is the context of that video," he began, smiling faintly. "The internet has a funny way of making things look worse than they are. My client was simply following procedure, dealing with an uncooperative individual. The video doesn't show the full interaction." He walked to the center of the room, his voice dropping slightly for emphasis. "Mrs. Walker escalated the situation. She refused lawful orders. She made it difficult for my client to do his job." Emma sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, her hands gripping the edges. Ethan reached over and gave her a reassuring squeeze, signaling her to stay calm. Harper continued, "And let's be honest, emotions are running high. We all sympathize with Mrs. Walker's condition, but sympathy is not evidence. We can't let a viral video cloud our judgment. My client deserves a fair assessment, not trial by public opinion." Ethan stood as Harper returned to his seat. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness to the stand." The judge nodded. "Proceed." A man in his mid-30s approached the stand, his expression nervous, but resolute. Ethan introduced him to the jury as Jason Lee, a former officer who had worked with Carter years ago. "Mr. Lee," Ethan began, "during your time in the precinct, did you observe any concerning behavior from Officer Carter?" Jason hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. He had a reputation for escalating situations unnecessarily, especially with minority civilians. He'd make snide comments, use excessive force, and act like it was his right." "And did you ever report these incidents?" Ethan pressed. "I did," Jason said, his voice firming. "I filed reports, but they went nowhere. The department swept them under the rug. It was an unspoken rule: don't cross Carter, or you'll regret it." Harper stood abruptly. "Objection. This testimony is anecdotal and irrelevant to the specific incident in question." The judge shook her head. "Overruled. Continue, Mr. Walker." Ethan turned back to Jason. "Did you witness any efforts by the department to hold Officer Carter accountable?" Jason let out a bitter laugh. "Accountable? No. If anything, they protected him. Complaints disappeared. Supervisors covered for him. He knew he was untouchable, and he acted like it." The courtroom murmured as Jason's words hung in the air. Harper quickly cross-examined him, attempting to paint Jason as a disgruntled ex-employee with a vendetta, but the damage was done. Next, Ethan presented the internal memos and complaints he had obtained, linking them to cases where Carter had been accused of excessive force. One document showed that a supervisor had dismissed a complaint against Carter, calling it an overreaction by a suspect. These aren't isolated incidents, Ethan told the jury. They're a pattern of behavior that's been ignored and enabled by the department. Harper, however, wasn't done. He called a supervisor from the precinct to testify, attempting to discredit Ethan's narrative. Officer Carter has always followed departmental guidelines, the supervisor said confidently. The complaints against him were investigated and found to be baseless. He's a dedicated officer who's faced undue criticism. Ethan rose for cross-examination. You claim the complaints were investigated. Were you personally involved in those investigations? No, the supervisor admitted. Then how can you testify to their legitimacy? Ethan pressed. Were you aware that some of these complaints were dismissed without the complainants being interviewed? The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. I can't speak to that. Ethan turned to the jury. This is the culture we're dealing with, a culture where accountability is an afterthought. Officer Carter knew he could act without consequences because the system around him protected him. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom grew. Ethan presented his final witness, Tara, the former intern who had worked at the precinct. Tara's voice trembled slightly as she recounted her experiences. I saw officers cover for each other all the time. Carter was one of the worst. He treated civilians like they were beneath him, especially black and brown people. I remember one time he slammed a man against a car for asking why he was being detained. Did you report what you saw? Ethan asked. I tried, Tara said, her voice steadier now. But no one listened. They told me to keep my head down if I wanted a future in law enforcement. Harper's cross-examination was brutal, trying to discredit her as an inexperienced intern with no real insight into the department. But Tara held her ground, her testimony unwavering. By the end of the day, Ethan knew the momentum was shifting in their favor. The evidence was mounting, and the jury seemed visibly moved by the accounts of Carter's behavior and the department's complicity. Ethan Walker stood confidently in front of the jury. The culmination of his case spread out in evidence before them. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension, the weight of the proceedings bearing down on everyone present. Ethan knew this was his moment to connect the dots, to leave no doubt about David Carter's abuse of power and the system that had enabled him. Members of the jury, Ethan began, his voice measured but firm. We've seen patterns of misconduct. You've heard from witnesses who have no reason to lie, people who came forward at great personal risk. You've reviewed complaints that were dismissed without proper investigation. But today, I want to show you something that ties it all together. He stepped toward the evidence table and picked up a portable recorder. This, Ethan said, holding it up, is a recording from inside the police department, a candid conversation between officers about Officer Carter's conduct and how it was handled. What you're about to hear isn't conjecture. It's their own words. The defense immediately jumped to their feet. Objection, Your Honor. This recording is inadmissible. It was obtained without proper authorization. Ethan turned to the judge, cutting Harper off. The recording was provided by a whistleblower who worked within the department. It exposes a culture of cover-ups and is crucial to establishing the systemic negligence we've argued. The judge deliberated briefly, then nodded. I'll allow it. Proceed, Mr. Walker. Ethan pressed play, and the courtroom fell silent. The recording crackled to life with the voices of two officers. We've got another complaint against Carter, one voice said. What do you want to do with it? File it under resolved, the second voice replied, his tone casual. You know how this works. Carter's good at keeping the streets quiet. We can't afford to lose him over a couple of angry civilians. The first voice hesitated. But this one's bad excessive force, possible injury. The second voice cut him off sharply. We've had his back before and we'll keep having it. Let this one go. The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Ethan turned to face the jury, his expression serious. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the culture that protected Officer Carter. It's a culture that prioritizes loyalty over accountability, enabling officers like him to act with impunity. How many complaints were swept under the rug? How many people suffered in silence because their voices were ignored? Harper stood again, visibly rattled. This recording is an isolated conversation. It doesn't prove my client acted improperly during the incident with Mrs. Walker. Ethan didn't flinch. It proves that any complaints against your client were never taken seriously. It shows a systemic failure to hold him accountable, which emboldened him to escalate situations like the one with my wife. The judge nodded for Ethan to continue. Ethan turned back to the jury. Let's look at the evidence we've already discussed, he said, pulling up a projection on the courtroom screen. Excessive force complaints, all tied to Officer Carter, each one marked as unfounded or resolved. Yet every witness who filed these complaints told a similar story: an officer who acted aggressively, who didn't de-escalate, and who used his badge as a weapon instead of a shield. He gestured toward Jason Lee, the former officer who had testified earlier. You heard from Officer Lee. He told you how complaints against Carter were routinely dismissed, how anyone who tried to speak up faced retaliation. You heard from Tara, who saw firsthand how the department prioritized protecting its own over serving the public. Ethan took a step closer to the jury, his tone intensifying. And then there's the video, unfiltered, unedited proof of what happened to Emma. Officer Carter didn't just overstep. He chose to use violence against a pregnant woman who posed no threat. He didn't hesitate because he didn't think he'd face consequences. He knew the system would protect him. Harper rose again, his frustration evident. Your Honor, counsel is grandstanding. The video is a single moment in time. It doesn't show what led up to the incident. Because nothing led up to it, Ethan interrupted, his voice cutting through the room. Emma complied with his demands. She answered his questions. And yet he escalated, not because of her actions, but because of his own bias and aggression. The judge raised her hand. Mr. Walker, stick to your argument. Ethan nodded, taking a breath. Let me be clear. This isn't about one officer making a bad decision in the heat of the moment. It's about a system that allowed him to think he could get away with it. That's what's on trial here. The jury members exchanged glances, the weight of Ethan's words settling in. Harper called his final witness a police supervisor who defended Carter's actions as necessary under the circumstances. Officer Carter had reason to believe he was dealing with a non-compliant suspect, the supervisor said. His response was consistent with his training. Ethan stood to cross-examine. Consistent with his training? Does that training include kicking a pregnant woman to the ground? The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. I wasn't there, so I can't speak to his exact actions. But you're here to defend them, Ethan interjected. Even with the video evidence, you're claiming his actions were justified. Is that the culture your department stands by? The supervisor stammered, unable to provide a clear answer. Ethan turned to the jury one last time. This is what we're dealing with, he said. A culture that refuses to take responsibility, even when the evidence is right in front of them. It's up to you to send a message that this kind of behavior will no longer be tolerated. As the court recessed for the day, the tension was palpable. The jury would soon deliberate, their decision carrying the weight of not just Emma's case, but the broader fight against systemic injustice. The case now rested in the jury's hands. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as everyone waited for the verdict that could set a precedent for accountability and justice. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that suffocated every breath. All eyes were fixed on the jury as the foreperson stood, holding the verdict in their hands. Ethan and Emma sat side by side, their fingers intertwined under the table. Across the room, David Carter sat stiffly, his face pale but impassive. The judge nodded toward the foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor, the foreperson replied, their voice steady but solemn. Please read the verdict. The foreperson unfolded the paper and began. In the matter of the assault charge against David Carter, we find the defendant guilty. The words hung in the air for a moment before the weight of them sank in. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Emma squeezed his hand tightly, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. The judge tapped her gavel once, calling for order. The defendant is hereby convicted of assault and misconduct. Sentencing will proceed immediately. David Carter shifted in his seat, his composed exterior beginning to crack. His lawyer, Michael Harper, leaned in, whispering furiously, but David didn't respond. The judge continued, her tone firm. Given the gravity of the offense, the fact that the victim was pregnant, and the clear abuse of power, the court sentences David Carter to 3 years in state prison. Additionally, the defendant is permanently barred from serving in law enforcement and will be stripped of all titles and privileges associated with his former role. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, some gasps punctuating the otherwise quiet room. David finally broke his silence, turning to Harper. 3 years? For what? Doing my job? His voice, no longer cold and authoritative, now carried a desperate edge. Harper tried to calm him, but David stood abruptly. This is a joke. I was protecting the public, and this is how I'm repaid? His voice rose, directed at no one in particular, but filled with bitterness. The judge banged her gavel again. Mr. Carter, sit down. You will not disrupt this court. David's shoulders slumped as he sank back into his chair, his defiance replaced by the weight of his fate. For the first time, his mask of confidence was gone, replaced by the realization that his authority and prejudice could no longer shield him. Ethan rose to deliver a final statement on behalf of Emma. Your Honor, while justice has been served today, this case was never just about one man's actions. It's about a system that allowed those actions to go unchecked for years. Officer Carter's conviction is a step forward, but the culture within the police department that protected him must also be addressed. The judge nodded. The court acknowledges the systemic issues presented in this case. A formal investigation into the department's handling of complaints will be initiated immediately. As the gavel came down for the last time, the case was officially closed. Ethan turned to Emma, who was wiping tears from her eyes. It's over, he said softly. We did it. Outside the courthouse, reporters and cameras swarmed the steps. Microphones were thrust toward Ethan and Emma as they emerged into the daylight. Mr. Walker, how do you feel about the verdict? One reporter shouted. Do you think this will bring lasting change? Another asked. Ethan raised a hand to quiet the crowd. Today's verdict is a victory for accountability, he said firmly. But it's only the beginning. Justice isn't a single moment, it's a process. We have to continue holding those in power accountable and pushing for systemic reform. Emma spoke next, her voice steady despite the flashes of cameras. This was never about revenge. It was about standing up for what's right. No one should have to go through what I did, and I hope this sends a message that things need to change. The reporters fired more questions, but Ethan and Emma moved past them, heading toward their car. As they drove away, Emma looked out the window, the weight of the trial finally lifting. David Carter, meanwhile, sat alone in a holding cell, awaiting transfer. The authority he once wielded was gone, stripped away along with his badge. For the first time, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions without the shield of his uniform. In the following weeks, news of the department's internal investigation made headlines. Senior officers were placed on administrative leave, and documents exposed during the trial led to the reopening of several previously dismissed complaints. The community demanded accountability, inspired by Ethan and Emma's fight for justice. David Carter sat alone in his prison cell, the once proud officer now reduced to an inmate bearing the weight of his actions. His days were marked by isolation. Even the guards treated him with thinly veiled disdain, aware of the high-profile nature of his case and the public's fury over his behavior. Word of his conviction had spread far and wide, and the fallout was swift. Former colleagues who once turned a blind eye to his conduct now distanced themselves. Some even publicly condemned him to salvage their own reputations. Carter's attempts to justify his actions, "I was following procedure," or "the media twisted," everything fell on deaf ears. Outside the prison walls, the ripple effects of the trial were being felt. The police department, under immense scrutiny, held a press conference announcing a sweeping review of its internal policies. The chief of police, visibly uneasy, addressed the public. "We acknowledge the systemic failures highlighted in this case," he began. "Moving forward, we will prioritize transparency, accountability, and rebuilding trust with the community." The promises sounded rehearsed, and skepticism ran high. Many in the crowd murmured doubts about whether real change would follow. Activists demanded concrete actions, independent oversight, mandatory de-escalation training, and protections for whistleblowers within the force. Emma Walker, however, had become a beacon of hope for many. The woman who once shied away from cameras now stood confidently in front of a crowd gathered at a community rally. Her voice carried strength as she addressed hundreds of supporters. "What happened to me could have happened to anyone," she began, her tone resolute. "And that's exactly why we can't stop here. Justice isn't just about one trial or one verdict. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I went through. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing in the crisp afternoon air. Emma held up her hand for silence, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. This isn't just my fight, she continued. It's ours. It's for every person who's been silenced, for every voice that's been ignored. We have to demand better not just from those in power, but from ourselves. We can't look the other way when we see injustice. We have to act. Her words struck a chord, igniting a sense of urgency among those listening. Reporters captured the moment, her image and message spreading across social media and news networks. Emma wasn't just a victim. She was now a symbol of resilience and resistance against systemic abuse. At home, Ethan watched the broadcast with pride. "You're incredible," he said when Emma returned that evening, tired but invigorated. She smiled softly, sitting beside him. "I just said what needed to be said." "There's still so much work to do." Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "And we'll do it together. This doesn't end with Carter. The department needs to be held accountable for every complaint they buried, every person they failed. Their commitment to justice extended beyond words." Ethan began collaborating with local civil rights organizations to provide legal assistance to victims of police misconduct. Together, he and Emma established a foundation aimed at supporting individuals and families affected by similar incidents. Meanwhile, the community's response grew stronger. Inspired by Emma's story, more victims of police misconduct came forward, sharing their experiences and demanding accountability. Protests and town hall meetings became commonplace, with citizens voicing their frustrations and advocating for reform. Back at the police department, the promised reforms faced resistance. Older officers grumbled about the overcorrection, while younger recruits cautiously welcomed the changes. The internal investigation, spurred by evidence revealed during the trial, uncovered widespread negligence. Several high-ranking officials were forced to resign. Their roles in covering up misconduct laid bare, yet progress remained slow. Policies were drafted, but their implementation faced bureaucratic delays. Activists, including Emma and Ethan, kept the pressure on, ensuring that promises weren't forgotten once the headlines faded. For David, the world outside prison continued to move forward, but his life remained stagnant. Letters of support from a small group of loyalists dwindled, replaced by reminders of the life he had destroyed, not just Emma's but his own. He spent hours replaying the events in his mind, each detail eroding the justifications he once clung to. One day, he received a visitor, his younger brother, Mark. The conversation was tense, marked by long silences. "You always thought you were untouchable," Mark said finally, his tone heavy with disappointment. "But look where that got you. Maybe it's time to stop blaming everyone else and start owning what you did." David didn't respond. His brother's words lingered long after the visit ended, a bitter reminder that his power and privilege could no longer shield him. Months later, Emma stood at another rally, her voice unwavering as she spoke to a crowd that had grown even larger. "Change is never easy," she said, "and it doesn't happen overnight. But every step forward matters. Every voice raised against injustice matters. Together, we can create a future where accountability isn't optional, it's expected." The applause that followed was thunderous, a testament to the movement she had helped inspire. 2 years after the trial, the Walkers' living room was filled with the sound of laughter. Emma cradled their baby daughter, Maya, while Ethan stood nearby, watching with a smile. The scars of their ordeal hadn't disappeared, but the joy of the present was undeniable. Their lives had changed in ways they couldn't have imagined, and while the fight for justice had left its mark, it also gave them purpose. "Look at her," Ethan said, reaching out to take Maya into his arms. "She has your strength, Emma. She doesn't even know it yet." Emma smiled, brushing a curl from Maya's forehead. "She'll grow up in a better world than the one we faced. We're going to make sure of it." That promise wasn't just words. The Walkers had turned their pain into action, founding the Justice Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of police brutality and advocating for systemic reform. The foundation quickly gained traction, thanks to Emma and Ethan's relentless efforts and their story's resonance. The foundation provided legal aid, connected victims with mental health resources, and hosted workshops to educate communities about their rights. Ethan used his legal expertise to mentor young attorneys, training them to tackle cases that sought accountability for law enforcement misconduct. Emma became the face of the movement, speaking at rallies, universities, and conferences. Her speeches didn't dwell on anger, but instead focused on resilience, unity, and the power of collective action. One of those speeches took place at a packed community center, where Emma stood before a diverse audience of activists, students, and families. She spoke with clarity, her voice carrying conviction. "We all saw what happened to me," she began. "But this fight isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been ignored, silenced, or dismissed because they didn't have a voice loud enough to be heard. We're here to change that." The crowd listened intently, their attention unwavering. "Change doesn't happen because we wait for it. It happens because we demand it," Emma continued. "It happens because we refuse to stay silent. This isn't just a battle for justice. It's a battle for dignity, for equality, for the right to live without fear." As Emma spoke, Maya's picture appeared on the screen behind her, a reminder of the future they were all fighting for. "I look at my daughter and think about what kind of world she'll inherit. Will she grow up fearing those who are supposed to protect her? Or will she grow up in a world where accountability is the norm, where justice isn't just a promise, but a reality?" That's up to all of us. The applause was deafening, the crowd rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Ethan watched from the side of the stage, his pride evident. After the event, a young man approached Emma. "Mrs. Walker," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "your story, it gave me the courage to come forward about what happened to me. I don't feel alone anymore." Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone," she said, "and we'll stand with you every step of the way." The foundation's impact continued to grow. Over time, they worked with other organizations to lobby for legislative changes, including the establishment of independent review boards for police misconduct cases. Some bills were met with resistance, but Emma and Ethan's persistence ensured that the conversation never faded. David Carter's case remained a landmark example of accountability. While he served his sentence, his actions became a cautionary tale for law enforcement agencies nationwide. Departments across the country began adopting new training protocols and stricter oversight policies to prevent similar abuses of power. Despite the victories, the Walkers knew the work was far from over. At the Foundation's headquarters, Ethan addressed their team during a strategy meeting. "Every win is important, but we can't lose momentum," he said. "The system doesn't change overnight. It takes constant pressure, constant vigilance." Emma nodded. "We've come this far because people believed in something bigger than themselves. We have to keep building that belief, one step at a time." As they left the meeting, the sun was setting over the city. Emma and Ethan stood together, watching the horizon. "You think we're making a difference?" Ethan asked quietly. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. "I know we are. And even if it's slow, even if it's hard, we're giving people hope. That's worth everything." That hope was evident in the lives they touched, the communities they empowered, and the conversations they sparked. Their fight had become a movement, one fueled by the belief that justice wasn't just an ideal, but a right worth fighting for. At a televised interview marking the 2-year anniversary of the trial, the host asked Emma what kept her motivated. "My daughter," Emma replied without hesitation. "And every person who's ever felt like their voice didn't matter." This fight isn't about winning every battle, it's about making sure the battles are fought at all. It's about leaving a legacy of justice, so no one else has to endure what we did. Her words resonated far beyond the screen, inspiring others to join the cause. From small-town protests to national policy debates, the Walkers' story became a rallying cry for accountability and equality. As the interview ended, Emma looked directly into the camera. "We can't do this alone," she said. "If you've ever felt powerless, know that together, we have strength. Speak up, get involved, push for change. Justice isn't inevitable. It's something we build brick by brick until it stands strong for everyone." The screen faded to black, but her message lingered. For Emma, Ethan, and countless others, the fight for justice was no longer a distant goal. It was a mission, a legacy they were determined to leave for the next generation. Emma and Ethan's journey reminds us that even in the face of injustice, resilience and determination can spark real change. Their story didn't just end in a courtroom, it became a call to action, a testament to the power of standing up against wrongdoing and refusing to stay silent. What would you do if faced with a similar fight for justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If Emma and Ethan's story inspired you, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that spotlight courage, resilience, and the pursuit of equality. Together, we can build a better future.
The sharp sound of Lisa Johnson's heels against the marble floor echoed through the nearly empty parking garage. She clutched her briefcase tightly, her mind racing with the details of the trial she had just won. It had been a grueling day, but as always, Lisa carried herself with poise. Her dark blue suit was immaculate, her natural curls framing her face like a crown. As she approached her car, the sudden blare of a police siren made her stop in her tracks. Two officers emerged from their patrol car, the fluorescent garage lights casting harsh shadows across their faces. She immediately recognized them, Rick Thompson and Ben Carter, officers with a reputation that preceded them. She had heard whispers of their methods, their unchecked aggression, and their tendency to target people who looked like her. "Evening, ma'am," Rick said, his hand resting on his holster. The smirk on his face sent a chill through Lisa's spine. "Officers," Lisa replied, keeping her tone measured. "Is there a problem?" Ben circled her car slowly, his eyes scanning her license plate, her bumper stickers, and finally her face. "You in a hurry to go somewhere?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Lisa glanced at the time on her watch, willing herself to remain calm. "I've just finished work and was heading home. Is there something I can assist you with?" Rick stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "Work, huh? Mind telling us what kind of work keeps a lady like you out so late?" Lisa's heart pounded, but she maintained her composure. "I'm an attorney," she said firmly, holding his gaze. "I had a late session at court. If you'd like, I can show you my ID." Ben let out a low chuckle. "An attorney, huh? Fancy job for someone like you." Lisa's breath hitched. She knew exactly what he meant by someone like you. Her skin, her confidence, her success, none of it fit the narrative they wanted to believe. "I'd appreciate if we could keep this professional," Lisa said evenly. "If I've committed a traffic violation, let's address it. Otherwise, I'd like to be on my way." Rick's smirk faded. "You seem awful eager to leave. Got something to hide?" Lisa opened her briefcase, pulling out her ID and bar association card. "Here's my identification," she said, extending it to him. "Now, am I being detained?" Rick snatched the ID, inspecting it with exaggerated scrutiny. "What's the rush? We're just doing our job." "Your job," Lisa said, her voice steady but firm, "is to serve and protect, not harass and intimidate." Rick's face darkened, and Ben stopped circling her car. "You've got a smart mouth," Rick snapped. "Let's see how smart you are at the station." Lisa froze. "Excuse me." Rick nodded to Ben, who stepped forward and grabbed her arm. "You're resisting an investigation, ma'am," Ben said, his grip tightening. Lisa tried to pull back without escalating the situation. "This is absurd. I've done nothing wrong, and you know it." Rick leaned in, his breath hot and heavy. "You think your big words and fancy job mean anything to us? Out here, we make the rules." Lisa felt her knees tremble but stood her ground. "You're making a mistake," she said through gritted teeth. "My husband is Judge Marcus Johnson. He won't stand for this kind of abuse." Rick's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Judge Johnson? Well, isn't that cute? You think his robe's gonna protect you out here?" Ben shoved her against her car, pressing her arms behind her back as he cuffed her wrists. Lisa winced at the pain but refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "This is illegal," Lisa protested. "I'll have both of you held accountable for this." Rick leaned closer, his voice low and taunting. "Good luck with that, sweetheart. Nobody's gonna believe your story over ours." As they escorted her to the patrol car, Lisa's mind raced. Every humiliating step felt like a blow to her dignity. Her confidence, carefully built over years of hard work, felt as though it was being stripped away. Once inside the car, Rick looked at her through the rearview mirror. "You don't look so tough now, do you?" Lisa met his gaze, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. You'll regret this. The ride to the station was agonizing. The officers exchanged crude jokes, laughing at her expense as if she were invisible. When they arrived, Lisa was marched into the precinct like a common criminal, her hands cuffed and her head held high. The stares from officers and staff burned into her skin, but she refused to let them see her falter. "Name?" the booking officer asked. "Lisa Johnson," she replied, her voice clear. The officer's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his reaction. "Occupation?" "Attorney," Lisa said. Rick, standing behind her, chuckled. "Better put unemployed on that form soon," he muttered. Lisa ignored him, focusing on the process. They fingerprinted her, took her mugshot, and led her to a holding cell. The cold metal bench and the smell of bleach made her stomach churn. She sat in silence, replaying every moment in her head, searching for anything she could have done differently. But deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't about her actions. This was about her existence. Hours passed before the first rays of sunlight filtered through the barred windows. Lisa's resolve remained intact, though her body ached from the night's ordeal. When the guard finally came to escort her to the courthouse, she squared her shoulders and walked with purpose. The humiliation was far from over, but Lisa was determined. She knew who she was, and she knew the truth would prevail. As they led her into the courtroom, her eyes scanned the room until they landed on the judge's bench. There he was, Marcus Johnson, her husband, her rock, her champion. His expression was calm, but the fire in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't over. O silencio no tribunal era quaes tangivel en quanto Lisa Johnson entrava na sala, suas algemas brilhando sob a luz artificial. Todos os alhas estavam nela, alguns curiosos, outros caios de julgamento. Lisa sentia o peso do olhar cultivo, mas sua postura era inabalável. Cada passo que dava era auto de resistência, lembrete de que ela não seria definida por aquela noite de abuso e humilhao. Atrás do banco do juiz, Marcus Johnson ajustou os óculos e fixou os olhos em sua esposa. Sua expresso era séria, profissional, mas Lisa conhecia aquele olhar. Ele estava furioso, mas controlava cada músculo de seu rosto como preciso de homem acostumado a carregar o peso de justiça. O caso do Estado contra Lisa Johnson, o escreveu anuncia, quebrando o silencio. Os policiais Rick Thompson e Ben Carter, sentados à mesa de acusação, mantinham uma expresso de confiança que beirava o descaramento. Rick lançou pequeno sorriso para Lisa, como se o teatro judicial fosse apenas mais dia comum para ele. Senhor Thompson, Senhor Carter, vocês podem apresentar as acusações? Marcus perguntou, sua voz firme como uma lâmina. Rick levantou-se, fingindo uma postura de respeito. Meritíssimo, a rai foi detida em flagrante por obstrequeo a justiça e conduta de sordera. Lisa manteve o olhar fixo em Marcus, esperando sua reação. Ele apenas assentiu, gesticulando para que continuasse. Ela se recusou a cooperar com uma investigação legítima, tornando necessário o uso de força, Rick prosseguiu. Sua escala de palavras era meticulosamente calculada, mas Lisa nota como ele evitava detalhes específicos. Marcus inclinou-se ligeiramente para a frente. E que evidências os senhores têm para corroborar essas acusações? Ben, que enteo havia permanecido em silencio, finalmente se pronunció. Timos nossos relatorios e o depoimento de ambos os oficiais, meritíssimo. Marcus cruzou as mãos sobre a mesa. Entendo. Senhora Johnson, ele disse, virando-se para Lisa pela primeira vez desde o início do procedimento, decide responder às acusações. Lisa se levantou lentamente, suas algemas tilintando. Sim, meritíssimo, respondo com calma. Primeiramente, gostaria de afirmar que sou uma advogada respeitada nesta cidade e que fui detida sem justificativa legal. Segundo, minha conduta foi absolutamente profissional durante toda intraqueo com os oficiais. Nenhum momento obstrui qualquer investigação. Interessante, Marcus disse, sua voz semi-moco aparente. Enteo segundo arai, apreseo foi infundada. Teremos que investigar isso mais a fundo. Ric abriu sorriso sarcastico. Com te do respeto, meritissimo, timos procedimentos que seguimos rigorosamente. Neo se trata de caso de discriminaco ou abuso. Marcaso encaru, o silencio perando como uma tempestade prestes a exploder. Official Thompson, pup me de retorica. Quero fatos. Ha registros de video ou audio dessa interacao. Ric hesitu, Elisa sensu o armadar. Li tentu mascarar o desconforto com uma tosse, mosso leave tremor sua vosso treu. Bem, as cameras do nosso caro patrulha estavam funcionando, mas ainda neo tivemos tempo de revisar as imagens. Interessante, Marcus repetiu. Vou ordenar que essas imagens sejam analisadas imediatamente. Ele fez uma pausa, olhando diretamente para Ric. Porque, se há algo que contradiz os relatórios, essa corte precisa saber. Ric troco olhar rápido com Ben. O clima de confiança entre os dois parecia ter começado a rachar. Além disso, continua Marcus, Arai menciona que sua detenção ocorreu sem motivo aparente. O que levou os senhores a abordá-la primeiro lugar. Ben pegaria. Estávamos realizando uma patrulha de rotina no estacionamento e encontramos atitude suspeita. Suspeita como? Marcus insistiu. Ben abriu a boca para responder, mas pareceu reconsiderar suas palavras. Ela estava nervosa, meritissimo. Nervosa, Marcus repetiu, o tom frio. Isso é tudo. Ric tentou intervir. Local conhecido por atividades ilícitas. Nos estávamos sendo cautelosos. Lisa finalmente interveio, incapaz de conter indignação. Cautelosos. Vocês estavam me assediando sem qualquer justificativa. Silencio na corte, Marcus ordenou, mas o olhar que lançou para Lisa era quase imperceptivelmente encorajador. Antes que o clima pudesse esfriar, a porta da sala do tribunal se abriu, e advogado de promotoria entrou apressado, entregando envelope ao escrivão. As imagens de câmara do caro patrulha chegaram, meritissimo, anuncia o escrivão. O coração de Lisa disparou. Ela não sabia o que exatamente aquelas imagens mostrariam, mas tinha certeza de que a verdade estava do seu lado. Colocam as imagens, Marcus ordenou. A monitor foi trazido e posicionado para que todos pudessem assistir. Quando o video cômico, a tensão na sala se intensificou. As voces de Ric e Ben preenchiam o espaço, suas palavras claramente audíveis. Uma advogada? Que piada, Ric dizia, rindo. Deve ser mais uma dessas que acam que sabem mais que a gente, Ben acrescentou, sua voz caia de desprezo. Lisa sentiu uma pontada de dor no peito ao ouvir a zombaria. Mas o que veio a seguir foi ainda pior. O video mostrava Ric emperando contra o caro, a força desnecessária clara como o dia. No tribunal, a atmosfera mudou imediatamente. O público sussurrava, e mesmo o advogado de defesa dos policiais parecia desconfortável. Marcus assistiu impassível, mas Lisa nota como seus punhos estavam cerrados. Quando o video terminou, ele se inclinou para frente. Oficiais Thompson e Carter, cômico, sua voz como trabalho contido, pode-me explicar isso? Ric abriu a boca, mas nenhuma palavra saiu. Ben olhou para o chão, evitando o olhar do juiz. Pelo que vejo, Marcus continua, não houve nenhuma obstacão por parte de Rai. Pelo contrário, houve conduta inadequada de ambos os oficiais. Este tribunal não tolera abuso de poder, e assegurou que essas acos serão devidamente investigadas. Lisa sentiu misto de alívio e fúria. Ela sabia que a batalha estava longe de terminar, mas naquele momento, a verdade finalmente começava a vir à tona. Marcus voltou-se para o advogado da promotoria. PECO que conduzam uma investigação imediata. Quero relatórios detalhados sobre o histórico desses oficiais. Lisa, ainda algemada, olhou para Marcus com gratidão silenciosa. Ele havia cumprido seu papel como juiz, mesmo com o peso pessoal do caso. Quanto a Senhora Johnson, Marcus diz, alhando diretamente para ela, eu declaro que as acusações contra ela sejam retiradas imediatamente. O tribunal explodiu murmurios, e Ricky ben pareciam mais tensos do que nunca. A humilhao que Lisa havia enfrentado ainda ardia, mas a dignidade com que ela supertou cada momento comunicava se transformar algo mais poderoso, a esperança de justiça. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the tension lingered like a storm waiting to break. Lisa sat in the chair beside her attorney, now free from the shackles but still wearing the emotional weight of the night's events. Her hands rested on the table, steady but clenched, as if grounding herself against the tide of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Across the room, Rick Thompson and Ben Carter whispered furiously to their attorney, their confident demeanor from earlier now replaced with visible unease. Marcus Johnson remained on the bench, his face a mask of professionalism, but Lisa caught the fleeting moments when his eyes softened as they met hers. He had done his duty, kept his role as an impartial judge intact, but the personal stakes were evident in the slight tension of his jawline and the subtle clenching of his fists. As the last of the spectators filed out, Marcus addressed the room. Court is adjourned for today. All parties will reconvene at the scheduled time for updates on the investigation. He rose, his robes billowing slightly as he stepped down from the bench. Lisa met his gaze as he approached her, a flicker of warmth breaking through his stern expression. "We'll talk at home," he said quietly, his voice low but resolute. "Right now, I need to follow up on a few things." She nodded, understanding the weight he carried. "Thank you," she said softly. "No need for that," Marcus replied. "We're not done yet." Lisa left the courthouse, her attorney walking beside her. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward her. "Mrs. Johnson, how do you feel about the charges being dropped? Do you think justice was served? Do you plan to file a lawsuit against the police department?" Lisa raised her hand, silencing the clamor. Her voice was calm but firm. "I am grateful for today's outcome, but this is far from over. The actions of those officers represent a much larger problem, one that extends beyond me. I'll be working with my legal team to ensure accountability and to fight for systemic change." The crowd erupted with more questions, but Lisa turned and stepped into her car, the door shutting out the chaos. That evening, the Johnson household was unusually quiet. Marcus arrived home late, his usual controlled demeanor now weighed down by the events of the day. Lisa sat in the living room, a glass of water untouched on the coffee table. "You look tired," she said, breaking the silence as Marcus entered the room. "I am," he admitted, loosening his tie and sitting beside her. "How are you holding up?" Lisa hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Angry," she admitted. "Frustrated. Embarrassed. But most of all, determined." Marcus nodded, reaching for her hand. "Good. Don't let them take that fire from you." For a moment, the silence returned, but it was filled with an unspoken understanding. Lisa leaned back, closing her eyes. "They think they can get away with this, Marcus. I saw it in their faces even after the video played. They still believe they're untouchable." "They've been protected for too long," Marcus said, his voice low but fierce. "I've seen it before, officers like them hiding behind their badges, their actions excused or ignored. But this time, they messed with the wrong person." Lisa's eyes snapped open, meeting his. "This isn't just about me," she said firmly. "This is about everyone who's been in my position, who didn't have the resources or the platform to fight back." Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You're right. And I think we both know this isn't just about holding those two accountable. It's about fixing a system that allowed them to act this way in the first place." Lisa nodded, the weight of their shared mission settling between them. "So, what's our next move?" Marcus's expression hardened. "First, we need to make sure this investigation is thorough. No loopholes, no excuses. I'll use whatever influence I have to ensure that. And I'll start reaching out to allies in the legal and activist communities," Lisa added. "We need to build a coalition, make this a case that shines a light on the problem, not just the symptoms." Marcus's phone buzzed on the table, pulling his attention. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's the district attorney," he said, answering the call. Lisa watched as his expression shifted, a mix of surprise and frustration crossing his face. Understood, Marcus said curtly before ending the call. What's wrong? Lisa asked, sensing the tension in his posture. Marcus set the phone down with a sigh. The officer's attorney filed a motion to suppress the video evidence. They're claiming it was improperly obtained. Lisa's anger flared. That's ridiculous. The footage came directly from their own vehicle's camera. How can they even argue that? Marcus shook his head. It's a stall tactic, but it's one we can't ignore. They're trying to buy time, hoping to build a case around some technicality. Lisa leaned forward, her determination blazing. Then we don't give them time. We stay ahead of them at every step. Marcus met her gaze, his expression resolute. We will. But this won't be easy, Lisa. They're playing dirty, and we need to be ready for whatever they throw our way. The next day, Lisa met with her closest colleagues at her office. The group gathered around a large conference table. Files and notes were spread out, the energy in the room charged with purpose. We need to build a timeline, Lisa said, pacing as she spoke. Every detail from the moment I entered that parking garage to the second I was released needs to be documented. One of her colleagues, Andrea, nodded, scribbling notes. We also need to look into their history. If they've done this before, we need to find the victims and bring their stories to light. Already on it, another lawyer, James, said. I've pulled up records of complaints against both officers. There's a lot of smoke, but no fire, yet. Most of the complaints were dismissed or buried. Lisa frowned. That's no coincidence. Someone's been covering for them. And we're going to find out who, Andrea said. Lisa stopped pacing, her voice steady but fierce. This isn't just about winning a case. It's about setting a precedent. We're going to expose every crack in the system, and we're going to make sure no one else has to go through what I did. As the meeting wrapped up, Lisa checked her phone, her inbox flooded with messages of support and inquiries from reporters. Among them was an anonymous tip. Check internal police memos. There's more to this than you think. Lisa's heart raced. The fight was only just beginning, and the deeper they dug, the more she realized how high the stakes were. The tip Lisa received weighed heavily on her mind as she drove back home late that evening. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about the two officers but something larger, something more systemic. The words from the anonymous message echoed in her head. Check internal police memos. There's more to this than you think. Lisa parked her car and stepped into the house, greeted by the faint hum of a news channel playing in the background. Marcus was in his study, leaning over a stack of papers with a pen in hand. You're home late, he said without looking up. So are you, Lisa replied, dropping her bag on the nearest chair. Marcus finally glanced up, his brow furrowed. What happened? Lisa handed him her phone, the anonymous message open on the screen. Marcus read it silently, his expression growing darker with each word. An anonymous tip, he asked, setting the phone down. Yeah, Lisa said, crossing her arms. It could be nothing, or it could be everything. Either way, we need to follow it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. If there are internal memos, it means someone in the department knows more than they're letting on. But getting our hands on that won't be easy. Lisa sat on the edge of his desk, her determination unwavering. I have a contact at the local civil rights organization. They've dealt with police whistleblowers before. I'll reach out in the morning. Marcus nodded but didn't look reassured. You're taking a big risk. If someone's leaking this, they'll be in just as much danger as you. Lisa met his gaze. Marcus, I'm already in danger. They targeted me because they thought I was powerless. If I back down now, they win. Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. I know. He hesitated, the vulnerability in his voice surprising her. I can't lose you. Lisa softened, leaning down to kiss his forehead. You won't. We're in this together, remember? He nodded, but his eyes betrayed the fear he was trying to suppress. The next morning, Lisa met with her contact, Olivia, a seasoned activist who had spent years exposing corruption in the city. They sat in a small cafe, their conversation low but intense. I don't trust anonymous tips on their own, Olivia said, stirring her coffee. But if this is real, we'll need more than just memos. We'll need whistleblowers, witnesses, something that ties it all together. Lisa nodded. Do you know anyone inside the department who might help? Olivia hesitated. There's one person. Detective Karen Diaz. She's been vocal about reform, but she's walking a fine line. If she helps us, she's putting her career, and maybe her life, on the line. Lisa's stomach churned at the thought. Can you reach out to her? I can try, Olivia said. But if she agrees, you need to be ready. This could blow up fast. Later that afternoon, Lisa returned to her office, her team buzzing with activity. James approached her with a folder in hand, his expression grim. We found something, he said, placing the folder on the table. Lisa opened it and scanned the contents. Inside were records of past complaints against Rick Thompson and Ben Carter, dozens of them. Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics. Most of the complaints had been dismissed without investigation. This is a pattern, Lisa said, anger boiling under her calm exterior. They've been doing this for years, and no one stopped them. Andrea, who had been reviewing the documents, chimed in. It gets worse. Look at who signed off on the dismissals. Lisa flipped through the pages, her eyes landing on a familiar name, Captain James Harrell, the head of the precinct where Rick and Ben worked. Harrell, Lisa said, her voice dripping with disdain. He's been protecting them. James nodded. And if the tip is right, he might be the one pulling the strings. Lisa's mind raced. The pieces were starting to fit together, but they needed more. We need to dig deeper. If Harrell's involved, he won't go down without a fight. That evening, Olivia called with news. Diaz is willing to talk, but she wants to meet in person. Somewhere discreet. Lisa agreed, and they arranged to meet at a small park on the outskirts of town. The next day, Lisa arrived early, scanning the area for anything suspicious. She spotted Diaz sitting on a bench, her posture tense, her eyes darting nervously. Detective Diaz? Lisa asked, approaching cautiously. Diaz nodded, her expression guarded. You must be Lisa Johnson. That's me, Lisa said, sitting down beside her. Thank you for meeting me. Diaz glanced around before speaking. I don't have much time. If anyone finds out I'm here, I'm done. I understand, Lisa said, keeping her voice calm. But we need your help. Someone tipped me off about internal memos that could expose what's really happening in your precinct. Do you know anything about that? Diaz hesitated, her hands fidgeting. I've seen things, emails, reports that don't add up. Harrell's been burying complaints for years, especially when it comes to Thompson and Carter. But it's bigger than them. Harrell's got connections higher up, people who owe him favors. That's how he's kept it quiet. Lisa's heart pounded. Do you have access to any of those emails or reports? Diaz shook her head. Not directly. But there's a server at the precinct where all the files are stored. If you can get a warrant, you'll find everything you need. Lisa nodded, already calculating her next steps. Thank you, Detective. This could make all the difference. Diaz stood abruptly, her nerves getting the better of her. Just be careful. Harrell doesn't play fair. If he finds out what you're doing, he'll come after you. Lisa watched as Diaz walked away, her words lingering in the air. Back at home that night, Lisa shared everything with Marcus. He listened intently, his expression grim. We'll need to move fast, Marcus said. I'll talk to the district attorney about a warrant. But Lisa, this is dangerous. Harrell won't go down without a fight. I'm not afraid of him, Lisa said firmly. You should be, Marcus replied, his voice heavy. People like him don't just protect themselves. They destroy anyone who threatens their power. Lisa placed a hand on his. That's exactly why we have to stop him. For every person he's silenced, for every life he's ruined. Marcus nodded, his resolve matching hers. Then we'll do it together. The storm brewing around Lisa and Marcus showed no signs of slowing. Each step brought them closer to the truth, but it also brought them closer to danger. Harrell's influence loomed large, and the fight ahead promised to test everything they believed in. The day of reckoning arrived with an intensity that felt almost tangible. Lisa sat in her office, surrounded by her team, each member focused on their respective tasks. The warrant for the precinct's internal server had been issued, and officers from the district attorney's office were already combing through files. Lisa, Andrea called out, rushing into the room with a laptop. They found something. Lisa stood, her pulse quickening. Andrea placed the laptop on the table, and the team gathered around as she opened a folder containing hundreds of emails. These are all from Captain Harrell, Andrea explained. There's correspondence with high-ranking officials, requests to dismiss complaints, and even instructions on how to handle officers who might speak out. Lisa's eyes narrowed as she scrolled through the damning evidence. This isn't just a pattern, it's a conspiracy. One email stood out. It was from Harrell to Rick Thompson and Ben Carter, dated a week before Lisa's arrest. The subject line read, "New priority." The message was chilling. "We've got a high-profile target. Keep her in check, but don't go too far. We can't afford another scandal." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. They were targeting me from the start. The room fell silent, the weight of the discovery settling over everyone. Later that day, Lisa and Marcus sat in the district attorney's office, presenting the evidence they had uncovered. The DA, a no-nonsense woman named Eleanor Price, listened intently, her expression growing darker with each new revelation. "This is enough to take Harrell down," Eleanor said, closing the laptop. "And it might be enough to expose the systemic corruption within the department. But it's not enough to stop them from fighting back," Marcus cautioned. "Harrell has powerful allies. He won't go down quietly." Eleanor nodded. "I'll prepare charges against Harrell, Thompson, and Carter. But you need to be ready for the fallout. This is going to get ugly." Lisa leaned forward, her voice steady. "We've been in the fire since the beginning. We're not backing down now." The trial against Harrell and his officers became the most high-profile case the city had seen in years. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community leaders, and citizens who had followed Lisa's story closely. Lisa sat in the front row, Marcus by her side, as the prosecution laid out the evidence. The emails, the video footage, and the testimony of Detective Diaz painted a devastating picture of systemic abuse and cover-ups. Harrell, once the picture of confidence, now looked like a cornered animal. His attorney tried to argue that the emails were misinterpreted and that the video was out of context, but the jury's reaction made it clear they weren't buying it. Rick and Ben fared no better. Their smug demeanor from Lisa's initial hearing was long gone, replaced with visible discomfort as their past actions were laid bare. During a break in the proceedings, Lisa stepped outside for air. A crowd of supporters waited near the steps, cheering as she appeared. "Lisa, you're a hero," someone shouted. She smiled, though the weight of the trial still pressed heavily on her. "I'm not a hero," she said, addressing the crowd. "I'm just a woman who refused to stay silent. And I'm not the only one. There are so many voices out there that need to be heard. This fight isn't just mine, it's ours." The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation. Harrell, Thompson, and Carter were all found guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. The courtroom erupted in relief and applause, but Lisa's focus remained on the faces of the men who had tried to destroy her. Harrell avoided her gaze, but Rick and Ben glared at her with a venom that sent a chill down her spine. "Justice is served," Marcus said quietly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Lisa nodded, but she knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. In the weeks that followed, Lisa and Marcus launched a community initiative to address systemic racism and corruption in law enforcement. They held town halls, organized workshops, and worked closely with local leaders to demand accountability and reform. Detective Diaz, now a key whistleblower, became a central figure in the movement, her courage inspiring others within the department to speak out. The case also led to statewide reforms, including mandatory bias training for officers, stricter oversight of misconduct investigations, and protections for whistleblowers. One evening, as Lisa and Marcus stood on the steps of City Hall after a community event, Marcus turned to her. "Do you ever regret getting involved in all this?" Lisa looked out at the crowd dispersing, their faces filled with hope. "Never," she said firmly. "This is what we were meant to do." He smiled, taking her hand. "I'm proud of you, Lisa." "Of us." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of the fight still present but now shared. "We're not done," Lisa said softly. "But we've made a start." Marcus nodded. "And that's more than most people ever get." Together, they stood under the city lights, a united front against the darkness they had faced. The journey was far from over, but their resolve burned brighter than ever.